everybody, welcome back to Rain and Pours. Today I'm doing a video on some troubleshooting things that were suggested by Kerry Kayla Glasgow in the Sheleeart Bloom group. Thanks Kerry for this idea. And I'm going to answer your questions today. So some of the questions that she's asked are, can we do a video basically doing a troubleshoot video? So this is my attempt at that. So some of the issues she wants me to target are overspinning and overstretching. They're sort of the same thing, so we'll cover that in the one take. If your cell activator is too thick or too thin, the pillow is too thick or too thin, your paints are too thick or too thin, and how to do layering and a couple of other questions that may be common in regards to this technique. So I'm going to try and tackle some of those and hopefully answer some of your questions. And we're going to start off with the pillow. Because your pillow is your first layer, it is often one of your most important layers, because if you don't have a good pillow, your paints are not going to flow correctly over the top and they're not going to hold up. So if your pillow is too thick, it may not spread, your paints may just sit on the top, or they could spin off entirely separate to the pillow. And if it's too thin, it will spread too much and you'll get overstretched cells. So with this technique, one problem leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So it's really helpful to catch those before they happen. So I've got an MDF round here that I cut out, and I'm going to show you what happens if your pillow paint is too thick. So this is some pillow that I've mixed up with matte gel medium, and you can see in there that it is leaving a trail, and it's not really going anywhere. It's like thick pudding. So that trail is at like 10-15 seconds almost, which is too thick for what I would normally use. Now you can tell it's thick because when you plonk it here onto the surface, it doesn't really spread far. So let's do all of what's in this bowl, and then I'll use this bowl to show you what happens when you thin out your pillow paint. Okay, so this is really gluggy. It's really, a lot of people ask what the word gluggy means. It's chunky almost. It's not even chunky because there's not chunks, but it just glugs out of the bottle. Like if you're tipping up ketchup or tomato sauce and it goes glug, 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 that's gluggy. So I'm going to use a color scheme that I've just been using today. So it's fairly simple, just metallics. And I'm just going to get some plates set up so that these can dry. And what I will do is I'll show you what these look like wet, and then if I remember, I'll show you what they look like dry. And I do have some examples that I've just poured of what they should look like. They look really good. Okay, so this is if your pillow paint is too thick. Okay, so I'm going to go for a swipe with these. And actually I should probably go with the bloom. Let's go with the bloom. So put these colors down in the middle. Generally with a bloom, if your pillow paint is too thick, it's not going to blow out. So I've got Matisse Silver, This Little Piggy Simplicity, I've got Amsterdam Lamp Black, and I have a little bit of This Little Piggy Frost. Now, in saying that my pillow is too thick, my paints are also a little bit thicker than what I would normally do. So let's go with our cell activator, and I'm going to need my mini blower. Okay. That's ready to go. Okay. And cell activator in the middle. The cell activator I'm using is Atelier Rich Gold. Okay. Let's blow it out. Okay, so I was really struggling with that to try and push those paints off to the side, and you can tell because I've got these really defined petals because the paint wasn't sort of smearing around and blowing where I wanted it to blow. In saying that, I've got a decent bloom, which is kind of frustrating because when you're trying to show how something negatively affects something else, it always turns out great anyway. So if you know what you're doing, I guess it's easier to get a result no matter what consistency you're using within a degree. But this pillow paint is definitely thicker than what I would normally use. So let's give it a spin and see how that spins out. So already I can tell it's not moving very far at all. Normally by this time my bloom has spread out. And what's happening now as well is my paint is rolling over itself at the edge. So you can see that the paint is disappearing here. So when your paint is too thick, it doesn't like to spread from underneath. And so the waves go like this. They go down and out. When the pillow paint is too thick, it comes up and over, and then it will roll over itself when it gets to here. So, and you get your design folding over on the underside. Okay, so that's not what we want. Now, what I would normally do is, if that starts to happen, I've got some just leftover paint that I have here. And I'm just going to pour that around the edges. And what that should do is prevent a lot of the friction that's near the edge that's causing it to roll under itself. And it should allow it to flow a little bit better. It won't completely stop it. And I hope you can see that the color of the rolling paint, or the flood paint, what do they call it? Extender, flow extender. It's different, it's gray because I was mixing in these colors to it before. So again, let's give it a good spin. And with thicker paints, you do have to spin it a lot harder. Okay, keep going. So it's also a lot harder to get enough paint off your surface so it doesn't crack. Thicker pillow paints will mean that there's a higher chance of your paint cracking. You are also more likely to get this lump in the middle. And that lump in the middle will mean that as that paint does eventually flatten out while it dries, that it's going to warp all of your center cells. So you really don't want that, because then your central design, where often you get the best cells, that becomes all wonky and weird and warped. So all I'm doing is using the weight of the paint that's in the middle there to bring it slightly off center. And I'm going to take this opportunity to clean up the spinning board, the platform, because all of this paint will eventually fly off to the outside. Okay, and let's give it one more spin. So now that I've shifted that central weight over, I'm going to spin it so that it flattens out towards the edge. Okay, so all of my paint is shifting here. And this is looking good. So, just touch up the edges, because this actually turned out pretty good. I'm not unhappy with this bloom. It's not a color scheme I would normally do, but I love it. So I'm going to keep this one, and I'm going to put this off to the side. And then I will come back and show you what happens with a thin pillow paint. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to reuse all of this pillow paint because I do have quite a bit of it in here. And I'm going to add water to it. And I'm just going to add plain water. And this is to illustrate what happens if your pillow paint is too thin. Now, because house paint is latex or acrylic based, you can add water to it to thin it down. In fact, that's what they recommend. You can also add Floetrol if you have it. I would add the American Floetrol. So this is still a little bit thick, so this is almost the perfect pouring consistency for me. And I'm not going to change anything else. My paints are going to thicken up just slightly, so I will adjust those as needed, again with a little bit of Josonja water. Okay, and a little bit more water in here. I'm really exaggerating this so you can see what's going on. So again, this is just my collection paints, leftovers. Right. Now this is really thin. This isn't even leaving a trail in the paint. It's pretty much dissolving straight away. This is almost what I would have my cell activator at. So for me, unworkable, way too thin. So let's give it a go. I'm going to pour that in the middle, and straight away you can see that it wants to spread. It wants to go out from the edges. Whereas the thicker paint didn't want to do that. Okay, so give that a little spin just to spread it. Then let's go with our... I actually really liked how that black stripe looked. So let's do a black stripe. I'm going to do a little bit more. Then our silver. Colour's still looking good, so trying to keep the same amount of colour. I don't know if you noticed with that other one, there was quite a bit of pillow showing through. That was because I didn't add enough colour to it. Okay, TLP Simplicity. Add the black. I think I added the black on top of the silver before, but it doesn't really matter. And then This Little Piggy Frost. And our gold cell activator on top. Let's blow this out. Okay, so this was a great example of a pillow that is too thin. So let me grab the... actually, no, that one's fine. So this is a great example of a pillow that was too thin because a lot of that pillow paint got blown up in the center. So that usually happens because you're putting a lot of air pressure down on the middle, your paints are blowing out straight away, and then there's nothing left to blow out, so it just blows pillow paint. So we've got really nice cells, we've got a nice blowout, and it blew out a lot easier, so I didn't have to really force the paint to move. So let's give that a spin, and I can already see that it's reached the edges, whereas before it took a little bit longer. The thinner paint has spread really nicely, and this is going to be the perfect opportunity to show you what happens if you over tilt and overstretch your paints. And it's going to be better to show that with a thinner paint than with a thicker one. So let me scrape up my edges because this is going to fling off basically all of that paint. I'm going to try it with this, but overstretching and over tilting usually works better if there's too much pillow on the surface. Okay, so take note of this now. This is with a thinner pillow. And I've got some really lovely cell shapes. Everything looks really nice and uniform. But I will grab the other one and show you the comparison. So this is the one where the paint was too thick, and that's the one where the paint was too thin. So I've got a lot more color coverage on here, and this one has a lot more negative space where that pillow was blown up. Okay, so let's try and get them almost side by side. Right, it looks like there is the same amount of negative space, and there is around the edges, but in the petals there is a lot more pillow paint blown up from the center. Now on the too thick one, it looks like pillow paint. It's actually not. That's the Simplicity, the TLP Simplicity, and I can see that when I tilt it in the light, I can see that reflecting and shimmering there. So a lot more pillow paint on this, and I can already see on the thin one my center cell structure is starting to break down a little bit. So let's really go for it and let's overstretch this, okay? I'm going to spin that really, really hard, and I'm going to try and get as much of that paint off as I possibly can. Now what we'll start to see is those central cells are going to lose their nice uniform shape. They're going to warp, they're going to wobble, and you're going to end up with almost a triangular shape with the bottom part dipped inwards. Okay, so getting a lot of this off. Okay, so I can tell that the cells are really starting to elongate. They're really starting to stretch out this way because all of the force is throwing them outwards. And these cells in here, this one's starting to get really ragged. Now, I'm going to give it another good hard spin. Let's get all of that paint off there. Now, the board being slightly off center is great. It's actually something that's going to help this as well, because all of the weight is going to shift towards where it's aiming off center. So that's going to really show and exaggerate how the force is distributed, and any wonky cells are going to be going in that direction. Okay, so now it's starting to become really obvious. All of these cells are now massive and they've lost their defined shape. These ones in the middle are looking worse for wear. There's still some paint there, so what you could do is move that, tilt it to shift those, but I'm just going to scrape and keep on spinning. Again, really want to over exaggerate. And then on the next canvas, I'll show you, or on the next surface, I'll show you tilting. So I don't normally tilt, I like using my spinner because everything shifts nice and evenly. Knocked over me water. So I often find that the same result that you get from over spinning and over tilting often looks almost the same as if you spin in one direction, then stop and spin in the other. So by spinning the opposite direction, what you're doing is putting opposite forces on your cells. Paint can get stuck on the surface the first time around, and then when you go to spin it the opposite way, it's stuck there, so it just warps in a different direction. I think I've pretty much got all of the paint off this surface that I can. So just give this one final go round and then let's have a look at it. Okay, so I would never ever spin a painting this much because it just looks terrible. So all of these cells up here went from really nice, small, uniform, clumped together cells to massive, widespread, and this is the shape that I was explaining before. So it looks rounded here and then dips in at the bottom. So usually that will happen the opposite way, as the edge pushes out and then the central part pushes in and you get that weird triangle. So all of your cells are no longer, you know, roughly square, roughly circular, roughly triangular. They're all irregular shapes. That's what happens if you overspin. So I'll set this one aside, let that dry, and then let's have a look at what happens if you over tilt. So if you'd like to do the Sheleeart Bloom technique, you can do that at sheleeart.com.au. And if you'd like to buy any of the This Little Piggy pigments that I'm using, you can get those at fluid-art.co. So this is another round board, and I just knocked paint all over my surface, and that's why the puppy pads are great. So next we will use our base paint again. So this is normal house paint for this one, not thick, not thin. This is perfect, and I'm going to put on a lot of pillow paint. So that's almost 500 milliliters of pillow paint, which is nearly, you know, a lot of the bottle. So let's put on our black line. Now the black line is going to be a great indicator for this, in regards to how we stretch and tilt it. Put on our silver. And I do have to remember that I'm tilting it and not spinning it straight away. And the black. Simplicity and Frost. Now, I don't know if you noticed as well with that last one, we lost a lot of the blue. There was no blue left on that, just because of how much we spun off the top. With our cell activator, let's blow this out. Okay, so I've got some really lovely things happening there. Now, I discovered the other day in my camera bag that I have a puffer tool that is used for cleaning the sensor on my camera. And I thought this would be perfect for blowing out those little patches of cell activator. Okay. The gold cell activator, because it is denser, it is less likely to part, but let's see. Now I'm just going to center it while I can. Now let's tilt. So the trick with tilting is you want to go slow to start with and then all the way back. So let's tilt off this edge and then we want to go spin it around this way and then come all the way back. So what I'm going to do is show you a decent tilt first and then a crappy tilt, I guess. So off that edge and then back. Already, so the reason I don't like tilting blooms is because already it's deformed. The cells are going wonky. Okay. So at this stage, that's looking decent. So now let's really ruin this, I guess. So I'm going to tilt all the way off this edge, come back to the middle, and going all the way to the opposite direction, then coming back to the middle. Now what you're likely to find tilting and stretching in this manner is cells on the edges are getting really stretched out and elongated, and I'm starting to see flocculation, so clumps of paint that weren't mixed properly, clumps of pigment that aren't mixed properly, all of that is becoming really noticeable, and my paints down here are starting to break up. So we're still got plenty of paint on here, and the reason I used a lot of pillow paint is to demonstrate that you need the correct amount of paint on there to start with. Otherwise things can go really pear-shaped and you're going to end up wasting too much pillow paint where you don't need to. So now I've started to get most of this off. Most of the paint is off. And coming back to this edge, making sure that edge is covered. Okay, and now this no longer looks like a bloom at all. It doesn't have any central structure. The cells are breaking down. I've got some really interesting cells, some really interesting peacock cells are happening. So the peacock cells are these ones down here, where you can see multiple colors of paint in the one cell. So I'm going to bring all the way back to the center. I'm going to scrape down my surface here, and then we're going to spin it. So this was a lot of paint to spin off. So luckily I can reuse this as my pillow, because that would otherwise be wasted paint. A lot of people just spin this off into a puppy pool and let that dry. That's nearly, you know, 1/8 of a can of paint gone. In monetary value here, it's nearly $10 worth of paint. So $10 doesn't seem like a lot, but if you are a person that doesn't scrape your paints and you spin it off into a puppy pool and you know you don't think twice about it, that is where the cost of this art form really racks up. So save as much paint as you can where you can. Alright, so that's ready. Let's put this back in the middle. And I'm going to clean this up because I know what's going to happen. I'm going to spin this and it's going to fly everywhere. Okay. We're not even close to being centered. That looks good. All right, let's give it a spin. So you can already tell it doesn't look like a bloom anymore. There's no structure to it. Not something that I would go for. Shelley has a marvelous way of doing these where she tilts them without causing all of this destruction and wonky cells and things like that. I've got no idea what she does, her magic touch. But yeah, when we started spinning these paintings, you know, it just makes all the difference. I think that's all the paint we're going to get off this. Give it one more big spin. And now I'll get the too thick one to demonstrate, because really the too thick one worked out the best of these. Alright, this is the one that was too thick, and that actually turned out to be a marvelous bloom. I think that it worked alright for me because I'm used to working with thicker paints. Our paints here in Australia are quite thick. And I often tell people to thicken up their consistency for their pillow paint. So I think that aids me, I guess. Now this is the one that's over tilted, overstretched, overspun. Chalk and cheese, right? Cells are all warped. There's no structure to it. This one you can clearly see the middle where we blew that out. That central structure radiates out from there. This one is all over the shop. The black is a perfect indicator here. So the black is really, it's still concentrated here. It's still pretty dark. This one, it's gone. It's just been spread out so thin that it's turned grey. That pigment layer in the paint has just been spread out too thin and it's no longer actually black. So this is what happens if you overspin, overstretch, over tilt, and you know, I'm getting issues like I can see little chunks of flocculated paint where the pigment in the paint has clumped together and it can be seen individually. I've lost most of the shimmer from my pigments. So we added Matisse Silver, we added Frost, and we added Simplicity. A lot of that shimmer has gone. It's spread out too far and it's no longer providing any sort of shimmer to that. That I might be able to show that on the camera. Let me see. So you can see that's the reflection of Frost, and Frost has tended to have concentrated where the cell activator is, but we've got none of that silver from the Matisse Silver, and we've got none of that Simplicity shining through. So overstretching and over tilting can not only make really weird warped cells, but it can also reduce the effectiveness of the shimmer in your paintings. So the next issue to tackle is cell activator. What happens if your cell activator is too thick or your cell activator is too thin? So to illustrate, I'm going to use two cell activators. I'm going to do a multi-bloom on the same painting. And let's see what that does. So to keep things consistent, I'm going to use the same gold cell activator. And I'm going to divide that up into 3 different containers and just add a little bit more paint to one and add a little bit more Floetrol to the other. So give me a sec, I will mix those up and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got my 3 cell activators mixed up. Now I'll show you these before I put my pillow down. This one is the perfect consistency for cell activator. It is flowing nicely off my stick in a long thin stream, and then right when it gets to the end, it does a little bungee jump back up to the stick. So it's really hard to demonstrate. Let me see if I can alter the angle for you. Just gonna do this, okay. focus on that. There we go. So drizzles nicely off the stick, and then right when it gets to the end of that stream, you can see it bungee jump back up. Okay, that is the perfect cell activator. This one, and also with cell activator, sometimes the Floetrol will tend to mute your colors slightly, just very slightly, but remember it will dry clear, so your colors will come back to normal. This one is too thick, so the color is more true to what is in the container, but this is gloopy. Okay, it's hanging on, it's like a booger. It doesn't bounce back up, it doesn't flow, it's just too thick. Okay, most likely that's not even going to blow out, it's not going to spread anywhere. This one is too thin. If you have too much Floetrol, it's going to dull your colors too much, and it's not gonna, even when it dries, it won't be perfectly accurate. So this one flows in a nice thin stream, but there's no bungee jump. At the end, it basically just flows off, it drips twice, and then it stops. Okay, so it's too runny. I could probably even thin that out a little bit more, because with the rich gold, it does tend to work a little bit thinner. So let's just make this really thin to exaggerate. Okay, so this is dribbling straight off the stick. All right, it's not holding a stream, it just dribbles straight off. All right, that is when your Floetrol, that is when your cell activator is too thin. So now let's see what happens on our canvas. Now I'm actually just going to add a tiny bit of Floetrol to the thick one, because I do want to give it the best chance of working, but still being thicker than what I would normally use. So I do want it to be a fair test. Okay, my apologies, I'm an idiot. I had the camera facing up at me still while I recorded this part, so I'm re-recording this bit. I just scraped off the first 2 blooms that I did because I wasn't looking at them, or you weren't looking at them. So all I did was I tested the plain cell activator and the thicker one, and I didn't get to the third one, but all I've done is I've poured 3 piles, similar in size, shape and volume, just to make this a fair test. Okay. Now I'm going to do the regular cell activator on this one because I know it will work. I know how it will look, even though it's been sitting there for a minute or two. Okay, so that's our regular one. Now let's do our thick one. Now this is so thick that it's not even running off the stick, it's just blobbing down. And the result that you'll see is that it's going to be a lot harder to try and spread that. Okay, and now let's do the one that is too thin. That just dumps straight off the stick onto the surface. What's that? Get out of there. Okay, so you can see a difference instantly in all 3 of them. This one works straight off the bat. Doesn't look the best because the paints were sitting there for a little bit before I put the cell activator on top, so you do want to work really, really quickly. I'm just going to blow out this little bit. Excuse my ugly head. The thick one, you can see that it's all clumped up in the middle. It was incredibly hard to blow that out, and it just pushed all of the other products out of the way. So I've left with that massive bit in the middle. I do have some really awesome cells around the outside. So you could make this work by thickening up everything else in your pour. And you can see that there aren't really any cells around the outside. It's just blown that out, and where the cell activator sort of landed, that's where it's landed. The thin one, by the opposite token, is very flimsy. The cells don't look like they're holding up. It's very dull, so it doesn't have the correct pigment color. So let's spin this out and see how they behave. And I'm losing the other one straight away, so let's bring this slightly down this way. Oh no, I dragged paint all through everything, didn't I? And going to just do a swirly pattern here on the inside, just to sort of tie everything together. And let's give this a spin. So this should push all of the paint towards the other edge, so away from that thicker one, just to make sure that they all spread nice and evenly. And again, let's get rid of all of this extra paint so I don't cover myself in it. Okay, and bring this back to, where is the center here? There we go. Give that a really good spin. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got all of the paint off. Now we may not see what happens while the paint is wet, so I will wait until these dry. But we can already see what's happening just by having different consistency cell activators. So this one, because it is closer to the edge, they are naturally going to warp. That was expected. Now, this one is the normal one. That's perfectly fine. The thicker one has much, much better color, and I may even add more paint to this just to make sure that it stays that rich. The lacing is much finer, but it does still have that clump in the middle. So if you're happy with that clump in the middle, I would say go with a thicker cell activator than a thinner one, because this is the thinner one. The thinner cell activator has basically warped, it's spun everything off the side, and all of those cells are looking pretty uneven and misshapen. So again, take some of this paint off, and I'm going to spin this even more because there is still quite a bit of paint in that center. And this is where you need to balance how much pillow you put down, how much paint you put on the surface. Make sure you've got enough color to cover your surface, and the cell activator has to be the correct consistency. Actually, let's push this way just a bit so that my center moves that way. And that's looking pretty spot on. So you do have to remember that when working with multi-blooms, they are always going to warp to some degree. Okay, you can't avoid that. Just because of how they're placed, the bloom no longer stays centered, so it is always going to warp a little bit. Okay, so this is what happens when you have regular cell activator, thick cell activator, and thin cell activator. Okay, so again, the regular one has plenty of warping in there to be sure, but there is still very defined cells. The thick cell activator, the cells have stayed much more defined, but we've got this glob of cell activator that was in the middle. And then we have the thin cell activator, which has basically just spun all the way off the surface. And you can see that the cell activator itself has dragged through the paint, as that wants to be flung off, but the paint wants to stay there. And that's evidenced by the paint underneath. We've got a solid block of color here. So that black paint has stuck to the pillow, the blue has stuck on top of that, but the cell activator has all slid off and taken anything that was attached to with it. Okay, so that is cell activators being too thin, thick, and regular. Okay, so everybody, I am back. It is the next day, so it's been about 24 hours since I painted these MDF boards, and I wanted to show you the results of all the experiments that I did and my other little personal experiment. So the reason I painted on these MDF boards, and these are unprimed MDF boards, they're 6mm, and these circles are about 28 centimeters wide, so about 11 inches. And the reason I painted on these unprimed is to see if they would warp. And I am happy to report that they did not warp at all. So you can see that's perfectly flat. They're laying perfectly flat against my tabletop, which is fantastic. And that means that I'm not going to have to prime these when I make my placemats. So just to show you from all angles that everything is perfectly straight up and down. It's all nice and flat. So the answer to that question is no, you don't have to prime MDF boards if they are 6mm thick by about 28 centimeters wide. I'm not sure about going larger than that if you would need to prime those. So, but at this size, everything is fine. Now let me grab the results of the other experiments so I can show you those. Let's just do two at a time. Okay, so here I have the painting where the paint was too thick, the pillow paint was too thick, and it is still wet. So the center of it is not perfectly dry yet, and that just means that the pillow was too thick. It's taking a lot longer to dry, so that's one of the side effects of that. And the other thing you'll notice, I don't know if you can notice it, that the cell activator has sunk. So that is quite a common thing. It is normal for your cell activator to sink a little bit. With a thicker pillow paint, it is a lot more noticeable. So you can see that as the light passes over it, that you can see those rivers of lightning where the cell activator is. Now this one in contrast is the painting where the pillow paint was thinner than what I would normally have. So the cells are much more spread out, much more stretched. It is fully dry. But the cells aren't as uniform, they are not as nicely shaped. So if I put those two side by side, you can see the difference there. The cells are much larger, they're a lot less uniform, they're a lot more warped. Yeah, and the colors aren't as noticeable. So where I have that frosty color in this over the silver with that blue, this one's lost all traces of that color. So you can definitely see a noticeable difference there. Okay, let me put these away. And I will bring you the next two. So the last two experiments that we did were what happens if you over tilt and overstretch, and what happens if your cell activator is not correct. So this is the example of a painting that has been overstretched and over tilted, completely destroyed, no structure to those cells. The lacing is also almost non-existent. It's just been spun off and stretched way too far. So this is why you don't want to overstretch your painting. And to finish up, this is what happens if your cell activator is not the correct consistency. So if you remember, we had the regular consistency, one that is too thick and one that is too thin. Again, these are both dry now. I can touch the centers and they're not moving, not warping, not sticking. So the cell activator that was the perfect consistency, it is a little bit warped because it was close to the edge, and when we spun this out, all of the details span out that way. The one that is too thick, Sort of held its shape. The cells are a little bit more defined, which is to be expected because you do have a bit more structure in that paint. And the one that is too thin, it's completely spun off the edge, and it's a lot more noticeable now than what it was wet, that the cell activator was its own separate layer and it's just been flung straight off the edge. Let me see if I can zoom in on that for you, and you can see that there. Let's see if I can even zoom in a bit closer. Here we go. Right, so there you can tell that it's just slid straight off. This is the normal cell activator, and this is the one that is too thick. Okay. So I hope that little experiment was useful for you, and you can see the effects of changing consistency on your pours, especially with blooms. A lot of people call me the consistency king because my recommendation is always check your consistencies first. If your ingredients are all correct and you're still not getting the results that you want, your consistencies are off. The bloom technique, as I've said before, 99% of things can be solved by adjusting consistency. So using those little examples there, making sure that your pillow is at the right consistency, so about a 5 to 6 second trace when you drizzle it back into the plate or into the mix. You can check out my video on that called Consistency is Key. It's one of the first videos I've done on this channel. And making sure that your cell activator is also the correct consistency. I haven't shown that yet. So hopefully you can understand what I was saying when I was demonstrating that in this video. You don't want that to leave a trace. You want it to be a nice long thin trail with that little last few drops just bungee jumping back up to the stick. Now you don't get that effect with anything other than Australian Floetrol, and that is the reason that we recommend it. That is the reason that it works for this technique. The other products, other Floetrols, other sort of additives that you mix together to make mock Australian Floetrol, they just don't have that snap, that springiness, that bungee jump that really makes a really great cell activator. So hopefully these experiments have shown you what can happen if your consistencies are off. If you're liking what I'm doing here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.